Hey everyone, you're listening to the Vent Podcast, your source for market insights, wine industry news, and updates on our current collections. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vent Podcast. I am joined once again by Billy Galanko in studio, back in the country. We had a good run with Adam, but Billy, it's good to have you back.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it was a good almost 2 weeks in Slovenia and Italy. So we can talk a little bit more about that later, but glad to be back.
Did you listen to any of the podcasts while you were gone? Do you think, where do you think the quality was at? Do you think we hit our mark?
Yeah, no, I listened once I got back, tried to disconnect a little bit from, and you guys are spot on. Adam's always great, and you're consistent. That's good.
Consistent, yeah, that's what we're striving for, is consistency. Why settle for greatness when you can be consistent? All right, so yeah, today I think we've kind of been in a lull the last 2 weeks. Not a lull, but we've had a big build up to this Bordeaux en Primeur collection. Did the webinar earlier last week. You can find that recording in the show notes. We'll post that recording of the webinar that we did. But we wanted to share a little bit more for those who weren't on the webinar, or maybe just to have some of this information in a pared down context on the podcast. So we wanted to dive in a little bit today and talk about the Bordeaux en Primeur 2021 collection that we'll be launching today. When you listen to this podcast on Wednesday, the 31st of August, collection will be live. We expected to have a little bit of a runway because it is our largest collection to date. It's $230,000 of total value. It's also our largest in terms of the amount of bottles held in the collection. So we sourced over 1,100 bottles, 1,164 to be exact, from 46 producers from Bordeaux. Billy, I'll let you talk a little bit about what en Primeur means and, how, just briefly, about how we acquired these wines and what the next 2-3 years of their life will look like. Yeah, and then we can talk a little bit more about how en Primeur is unique in a wine investment portfolio.
Yeah, and I think to your point, the purposeful runway, or at least the size of the collection, is on purpose because, one, as a futures piece, which I can dive in a little bit what that really means. It's a different type of asset. So say you have your Bordeaux wines that are already physical or back vintage. This is something that everybody should have in their portfolio. So we made a big enough collection so that both our current investors, but also new people coming to the platform for an extended period of time will have access to these wines. So yeah, taking one step back, what en Primeur is basically wine futures. As I was saying, came into really, commonality right after World War II. A lot of the producers in Bordeaux were having cash flow issues after the war. They were basically needing cash a little bit sooner after producing the wine. So basically what happens with en Primeur is a vintage will happen. So say just like this year, 2021, the winemakers will harvest the fruit, make the wine in the fall. It'll begin aging, and then over time it's taken out of whatever it was fermented in, whether that be concrete or stainless steel, occasionally in barrel, and it'll be barreled down, and the wine will be sitting in barrel until about March or April, where it's still in barrel, but then samples will be taken. And in April, what they basically offer is for the industry to come and taste how the wine is developing, see what the vintage was like in terms of a structural flavor profile. And then, so that's basically in April, the wine world descends on Bordeaux. So there's industry experts, merchants, critics, everybody comes and tastes the previous year's vintage. And then come May, what will happen is the Chateau will actually release offerings of these wines. Basically, you'll be able to buy these wines while they're still aging in barrel. And you actually get to dictate, once you've purchased them, like what size bottles you want them in. Well, it's more the pack size. So do you want 750 ml in like a 6-pack? Do you want a 3-pack? That's more of what you get to pick. If you pick larger formats, that becomes a little more expensive, and they just make less of those. But basically, so recapping, there's harvest, it goes through, and then come only about 8 or 9 months later, the wines are available for sale while they're still maturing in bottle. Come mid-May through June, you can buy them. And by you, it basically has this kind of complex system where the Chateau work through these brokers called courtiers, who then work through another layer of brokers called negociants. Those negociants then offer the wine to the general public. And by general public, it's more merchants, hospitality, folks like that. It's very almost impossible for an individual to kind of buy on Primeur wines directly from negociants. You have to have some special connections, a lot of money, what have you. And then basically once those negociants get their offerings, are all released on the same day, and you can get allocations. So if we have a relationship with a certain negociant, they'll allocate X amount of wine for you. So as a first growth, maybe they'll offer you 6 bottles. That seems like a small amount, but since in certain years there are very limited quantities, that's what happens. So a negociant will offer wines, and you'll have the ability to say yes or no, do we want to buy them? So Adam and I spent most of mid-May through June basically fielding these offers as they're released every day, like randomly. There's no rhyme or reason to when things are released. And we basically put together a portfolio of right and left bank wines based on the prices at which they were released at, the quality of the wines in terms of critic scores and what I tasted while I was in Bordeaux, and put together a large basket that's now, over $200,000 worth of wine for our investors.
Now we have all but one of the first growths represented in the futures offering. Do you get to taste the first growths when you were there in April, or are they kind of left out of this? How does that work? First growths, and maybe you can explain too exactly who they are briefly.
Yeah. So quickly again, I'm sure most of our listeners know, but the first growths in Bordeaux in 1855, the Chateau of Bordeaux were classified actually based on price of the wines that they commanded at the time. They were 5 or 4 at the time first growth wines. There was one added in the 60s, or was it the 70s where he actually broke through? Either way, one added in the 1900s. And these are basically just the top wines on the left bank of Bordeaux, Cabernet base. And yes, they do offer tastings. They are typically, I did not get to taste them because Vint is a younger company. And at the time I had not been there and had the personal connection. So basically we've been buying through Negociant for a greater part of this year, but most of those tastings are set up by Negociants ahead of time, and basically for the biggest buyers. So next year I anticipate us being able to taste those. I was not able to this year, but yeah, it's really actually interesting. It's a good point that you say all but one, because Latour actually backed out of the on Primeur system. And what this was really is more of an effort again to kind of hold their stock. And we'll touch on this a little bit later, and kind of minimize how much they release all up front in an effort both to kind of participate in appreciation of the wines down the line, but also to get a better sense of who the people are who are actually purchasing the wines, at the end customer.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think that, we've said maybe podcasts leading up, I think Adam and I maybe discussed it, the opportunity to acquire wines at this price. I mean, this is by far the best opportunity you're going to get to acquire such high quality wines from a coveted region at this price point, right? So there is a kind of built-in discount. There's incentive for merchants to purchase these wines on Primeur. And yeah, so it is great that we got to get such a broad breadth of producers from all up and down the classifications, wines that... Go ahead.
Yeah, and just to build on that too, I think what's interesting is when you say value, sometimes, the price of the wine can appreciate, and these are the typics in, but it's like you're also buying as close to the producer as you can get. These wines are, directly from the producer. They're going to be in original wooden cases. They're going to have like absolutely perfect provenance. So there's something to be said for that too, rather than just maybe you could find a bottle of this wine later by itself that's been in some guy's cellar and has like bounced around its whole life. Like these wines are, the provenance is absolutely pristine and the best you can get. So there's also value in that, and not just the price.
Yeah, that's right. And the pricing with what we're seeing with comparable vintages, which I know we used in the webinar, we go into a little bit more detail on this, but we're kind of been using the 2017 vintage in Bordeaux as sort of the benchmark or the comp for this 2021 vintage. Maybe talk briefly about some of those, what went into kind of 2017 being the comp, and the fact that we have been seeing favorable pricing, getting some value out of these 2021s relative to the price of the current 2017s.
Yeah, really high level. 2021 and 2017 were both kind of cooler years overall, lower yields overall in terms of grapes, in terms of wine produced as well. 2021 was actually a little lower than 2017. Both vintages, frost early in the growing season, as well as rain kind of around late June and July. So it kind of made a little bit more of a restrained wine, as opposed to some of the different vintages kind of surrounding on either side, with 18 and 19 and ahead of 2017 as well, kind of being a little bit more riper, a little bit more full-bodied vintages. So, and in terms of stylistically, these wines are a little bit more similar, although 2021 kind of had a little bit more prolonged coolness that's really led to these kind of classic balanced Bordeaux wines. I remember when we were tasting there, we had a few of the wines, and the British merchants I was tasting with just kept saying these are really like a traditional claret, like, how the Brits call red Bordeaux clarets. And there were a few, and they were saying that, some of the years that they had been tasting recently were bordering more on, in their terms, a new world wine. I mean, they have a really old world palate, but they were just so ripe and fruit forward that they were saying, when you got a good one this year, it was back to that kind of fresh balance and also secondary notes. So
yeah, which, if someone's buying Bordeaux for either consumption, well, most likely for consumption if they're an enthusiast or a collector, they're going to be looking for a style, I would assume, most likely that's lends more towards like kind of that freshness, the balance with the tertiary notes, more of an old world style versus like that big new world style. Or did you hear, was that just the company that you were with? Or do you think that, if folks are going to buy Cabernet or Merlot based wine from Bordeaux, they're looking for that versus maybe what they might get out of Napa Valley?
Yeah, I mean, what you're always looking for is a balance of fruit and acid. And what they were saying is some of the wines that they had tasted in other years were considered good years is because they got ripe enough. And like Bordeaux, it used to be hard to ripen things all the way. And now, especially you'll see this year, there's heat wave and drought and things are going to be ripe enough. So what they're really looking for is this balance of acid and fruit. So over time, the acid along with the tannin helps the wine develop and mature as it ages. So it's kind of what they're looking for. And like, you want enough fruit so it doesn't just drop out and you kind of just have no fruit in 10, 15, 20 years. But at the same time, if you have too much sugar and alcohol and fruit as it matures and that kind of tends to drop out, there's not going to be a lot of structure left to support the development down the line. So yeah.
Well, I mean, it sounds like there's some positive qualities with the wines that, we were able to source, and there's always gems in every vintage. And that was, I think, what was so important about you being able to be on the ground there and to taste some of these, especially the ones that, the first growths. I know you say you didn't get to taste those this year, but it's kind of an expectation of what the quality will be like for those wines. So, but it's really good to be able to taste some of the other producers in the lineup too. And so, yeah, we're excited about that release. Another kind of trend that we've seen in the region over time related to the futures has just been reduced volume of the last 4 vintages, both in the amount of wine produced and the amount of wine actually being offered during the futures, during the on Primeur window. For instance, this 2021 harvest was down more than 20% versus the 10-year average. That was a number that we shared during the webinar. And so what happens as the years progress on, people are, they're obviously looking for the best wines from the best years, but as a wine ages, there's less of it on the market. And so folks begin anticipating new releases of that wine, and especially new releases of wines that maybe match in quality a year that they were looking for, that maybe is out of their price range or that they simply can't find. And so whenever we kind of are on the cusp and have that catalyst of a new vintage, which is about to go from barrel to being bottled and then released, there's an opportunity for potential price appreciation there. And the fact that the harvest and the volume overall was down of this vintage will further put, I think, likely pressure on supply and hopefully therefore raise the value as demand hopefully stays consistent. So these are some kind of things that we're thinking about, anticipating lower supply, but also increased demand because of the relatively low volume of these past vintages.
Yeah. And like you were saying, there's 20% less fruit harvested this year. And then, due to some of the challenging conditions with some mildew and some of the moisture earlier in the year, there was a lot of sorting done. And like that sorting basically just means they're picking out the best fruit. So they're still making a good wine, but it just reduces the amount of wine that can be made. And then to your other point, with Chateau wanting to hold on to the wines and participate in some of that appreciation or release less at the time, there was on average more than I think the range was 30. It was more than 30%. I think I saw some as high as 60% less wine released this year than in recent years, even last year. So it's there's just less wine becoming available on the market in addition to, and by market forces, in addition to the yields, reducing the actual amount of wine made. So there's a bunch of factors that are leading to this increased scarcity.
Yeah, and kind of another point that we have been making and we made in our thesis relative to value is that we've talked about in our podcast, obviously with our other collections, this seeing such a strong kind of bullish trend, price appreciation around Burgundy and Champagne and kind of other top regions, especially around France, seems to be a real opportunity for Bordeaux, even as it's, the number one traded region by value globally. It's still an opportunity, I think, for it to emerge as a source of relative value among some of these other regions. So, part of our thesis is that we might be able to see continued uptake in these upcoming vintages of Bordeaux and collectors really looking for them, and hopefully prices being driven up because of that, just because some of the prices in Burgundy are getting so astronomical. There might be an opportunity for Bordeaux to emerge as an opportunity for value and therefore drive the price up of those wines as well.
Yeah, and on that note, too, just speaking of releases, I kind of quickly went over how we selected wines this year, but on the whole, in terms of British pounds, the wines were only 1% more expensive this year. The releases, typically over the past 20 years, you had seen producers kind of increasing the price of their wine year to year a lot, even regardless of the quality of the vintage and stuff, especially when making the really good vintages fairly expensive. So this year, some merchants were hoping they would kind of like sharpen their pencil, as they say, a little bit more and even come in less. But, taking into account inflation and some other things, with the wines only going up 1% this year, there were certainly a lot of good values to had. And that was on the average. There were certainly some that were less than last year. So yeah, it was a really interesting year just to be judicious and find opportunities.
Yeah. And this is something that only comes around once a year, the opportunity to purchase these wines. And so if you're a collector and a wine enthusiast and a drinker of wines, that kind of this is a prime time to be purchasing. And so this is also kind of a unique opportunity to make investments, because this is, the only on Primeur collection that we'll be doing for this year, and it won't be until another year where we have another collection. I know plenty of people who only buy on Primeur Bordeaux, and that's kind of their style of investing. So I think that this collection definitely is a cornerstone piece in a portfolio. It deserves to make up a chunk of your allocation towards this top tier of assets like Burgundy and Bordeaux. Yeah, and with the built-in value there already, being that we're able to get advantageous pricing since we're in kind of that pre-bottling stage. Yeah, I think there's a really strong investment thesis behind this collection. So we're excited to launch it. If you have any questions about the offering or how it fits into your portfolio, obviously you can reach out to us, but we're very proud to offer this on Primeur collection as our 40th offering on the Vint platform. Yeah, and moving a little bit beyond our upcoming collection, wanted to touch a little bit on something that you kind of came back and talked to me about, and I thought was really interesting. When we mentioned it a few times on the podcast in the past, when we get into the weeds of talking about wines that we enjoy, but orange wines. On your trip to Slovenia, you got to explore you had some unique experiences, I think, which brought to mind the idea of some of these wines emerging as potentially investable in coming up in the future. Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the experiences you had in Slovenia this time out there, and some of the wines that you were able to experience.
Yeah. So like we've mentioned before, outside of a lot of the traditional wines and work, I drink a lot of these natural wines and orange wines, which actually led my partner and I to going to Slovenia as our trip. Turns out I knew they had a storied history of winemaking, but they also have beautiful nature. But the more I kind of dove into their kind of background, first I got that book I've referenced before, Amber Revolution, and then I read deeper and deeper into orange wines and kind of the culture here. And initially I was thinking more only about Georgia, but as this kind of modern trend has come around, most people are kind of adopting orange wine. It's like they're calling it a trend, and they're saying like, oh, any wine with skin contact is this kind of orange wine, and they're not really taking it seriously. It's kind of more just a style of wine that maybe is easily quaffable. But the more I read about it, the same names kept coming up. There was Jasko Gravner, and Stenko Radikon would come up regularly, and I was always wondering how every orange wine conversation starts with these two guys. And it turns out they're based in this area of northern Friuli, kind of called the Kolio. The town's called Oslavia, and it's used to be part of Slovenia. Now it's not. It's basically right outside their border, just keeps going back and forth. And so we went down there, we tasted, we actually stayed in an area called Goriška Brda, which is 10 minutes away from Oslavia, the actual town. In front of us was like an amphitheater of vines, and you could see Italy. So what was cool there is we basically got the experience of Friuli and Slovenia. We drove through down and actually ended up in Venice as well. So we drove all the way through Friuli, and we basically kind of did a deep dive on two varietals, really, Ribolla Gialla and Friulano. Friulano is also called Sauvignon Nas. It's also called Sauvignon. Some of the Slovenian producers call it Yakult. It used to be called Friulano Tokaj, which is kind of interesting. And then the people in Tokaj in Hungary were like, just like in port and champagne, they're like, you got to stop calling it this because your wine is nothing like ours. It's not even made from the same grapes as ours. So they call it Friulano now, basically coming from Friuli. And then right over the border there in Slovenia, they have a bunch of names for it. The name Yakult is actually Tokaj backwards in Slovenian. So it was people kind of making a little poke at fun there. But yeah, no, so what's interesting is this area has been kind of the crossroads of cultures for years. It was part of the Byzantine Empire, it became part of the Venetian Empire, and then down the line, even was part of the Habsburg Empire. So it has these traditions of winemaking. I mean, the winemaking goes back to Roman times, but it has these traditions of mixing cultures and styles. Just a little bit of background on Friuli is maybe some of our listeners might have known that in the 60s, the guy named Mario Schiappetto really brought down Germanic winemaking approaches of clean, crisp white wines and kind of married them with varietals in the area, as well as some of the French varietals that had been brought by the Habsburgs in the 1800s. And he started making these really crisp, clean, like linear stainless steel wines that were way ahead of their time. At the time, many people in Italy were making kind of old big barrel fermented. They're kind of like these lackadaisical white wines that didn't really have a lot of fruitiness and freshness to them. So he kind of revolutionized the style to much of like what we might know today is, kind of think of your crisp, lean Pinot Grigios or Chardonnays or some of those styles of wine. He really revolutionized that in Italy. So it kind of put Friuli on the map for that. He would make both whites and some reds that way. They're known kind of for Merlot up there and in that large bulk kind of market. But in recent years, more native varietals like Friulano have come back into the fold, Ribolla Gialla, and they're really starting to embrace these wines on a broader scale. So right now, I think the DOC allows like 18 single variety wines to be made. Why it's important that we mention this really clean styles is that basically all of the traditional winemakers, they've been making wines here for centuries, basically switched over to this super clean style in the 70s and 80s. They got rid of their old tanks. They got rid of them. They never really used amphora as much there, but they got rid of, smaller vessels in basically trading them for big stainless clean steel production. The wines were, well lauded. They were popular for the time, but then what's his name? Jasko Gravner. Wow. Pause there. I always get Stenko and Jasko mixed up as terms of first names. But Jasko, he basically was like, why are we making this wine this way when our ancestors or our, basically past generations were making these skin contact wines? So he made a conscious effort, basically, even though his company was thriving, to basically get rid of all of his clean winemaking equipment and went back to the old style of larger vessels, extended skin contact. And he started making Ribolla Gialla in a really traditional way. He kind of spawned this school around him, of which one was Stenko Radikon. And then so in the mid to late 90s through the early 2000s, there was kind of this revolution of going back to the old style of skin contact winemaking. Along this process, Gravner actually made what he called kind of a pilgrimage to Georgia. So he brought back the Kvevari, those big amphora pots, and he started aging his wines in those as well, which also caught on in the region, but everything's not exclusively made there, so they're still different than Georgian wines. But this is really what inspired many winemakers throughout the world to kind of pursue these orange wines. They started in the 90s and they just kept at it, even though, mainstream winemakers and mainstream critics were actually criticizing them. They were like, what are you doing? This is really strange. You were making great wine before. They would submit wine to competitions. They would just get returned. So it's interesting. They had this kind of perseverance to keep powering through making these wines that had extended skin contact, even though they're made from white grapes. So they had like medium tannin, high acid, and they've been aging beautifully for the past 20 plus years. The quality of these wines, both young and old, has inspired this general macro orange wine movement. It's helped put actually Georgia, which inspired them, back on the map more, and is kind of the impetus for what you're seeing in a lot of these wine bars. So bringing it back to Vent and an investable nature, I was actually at a restaurant called Subida. I was lucky enough through we've talked about it before, Club de Van, a membership that it basically has an NFT membership, that I was able to get connected to Michael Madrigal, who is a sommelier in New York, and he made the intro to this restaurant called Subida. And it's just over the border in Friuli from Slovenia. We could actually see it from our hotel. It's kind of cool. We asked our waitress the first night what direction it was, if we could bike there, and she just like pointed to it. And so that was pretty cool. But yeah, Mitya, he's a winemaker, double generation winemaker there, and he also runs the hotel, restaurant, everything that it's a part of. And he was our personal sommelier that evening, which was really neat. And I got to taste a 2004 Ribolla Gialla made by Radicon, and he had also decanted a Friulano for me earlier that day. It was really interesting to see their different decanting approaches. But he basically
what temperature are they serving that at?
The Friulano was cold. That was
okay.
It was on ice, but it was basically in, like, picture a chemistry beaker. It was a round globe with like a really thin neck on the top, and it was like I hadn't really seen a decanter like it before, and it was pretty cool.
Did they like decant it and then pour it back in and then the bottle and then put it on ice, or why did?
So that was for the Friulano. That one, he basically kept the bottle itself in ice, and then it was kind of like a long flat ice bucket. So the beaker like thing was actually next to it. And what the shape allowed it to do was the wine to sit at the bottom and be exposed to air in the top of like the bulb, but it was still touching the ice. So it was both opening up while cooling down at the same time. And I think part of that was, I think this was stored at probably just regular cellar temp, like, 55 or 60 or something. So they wanted to bring it down a little bit more, because as it was in the glass, it continues to warm and open up. But he poured me some of the Radicon, the 2004 Ribolla Gialla, from a traditional decanter. It had a ton of sediment, and that's why you need the decanter, but as well as to open up so the tannins there. And he told me when I had it, basically think about like at least like a Premier Cru Burgundy, or think about a high quality aged Burgundy. And the nose was very much like that. It had that earthiness, that like really unique developed sense. I'm trying to think of some of the terms, but maybe like be like ginger, or some of like all of those really interesting like spicy notes that you get after a really well-aged Pinot Noir. That kind of, the fruit's still there a little bit underneath, but it just really had this complexity and depth of aromatics that I had never tried before. And then you take it on the palate, and the acid was still there, shining through. The structure is just perfect. The tannins had mellowed, and the color even was like almost like an aged Burgundy. It at this point, had turned almost like from an orange more towards like I don't want to say like a bronze, but in between there, like
a light brickish kind of.
Yeah, he was developing like some pinkish hues as well. Not exactly sure where that all was coming from, but what was interesting, so I had seen these Radicon wines and Grobner wines, both in the States and elsewhere, selling for well over $100 a bottle, back vintages at $200 a bottle. And it really made me think about what the future of investable wines, as it transitions is. When I'm traveling and trying to taste wines from new regions, you're looking at like, cool, here are these fun, interesting varietals, and maybe they're not made in an ageable manner, but these are serious wines that, this one was 18 years old, and it was, beautifully aged. And these wines are just now kind of reaching this peak. So while some people are looking at orange wines kind of as a fad, there are these really kind of serious, potentially really nicely ageable wines that are going to be coming onto the market, made in really small, quantities. And they're basically setting themselves up to be potential investment opportunities down the line. And not to mention Stenko Radicon, sadly, I think he was in his early 50s, died in 2016. So it was either 50s, either way, he wasn't, it was an unexpected passing. So I was able to get one of the bottles of 2008 that he had personally made, but there's some, that adds to some of the prices for some of his wines. But it's not two things people put together when they think of investment grade wine and orange. But if you mention either of these producers, and there's a handful of others as well, kind of in that upper echelon, with more emerging as well. So thought that was interesting.
Who do you think the market, in terms of like the collector market, would be for wines like this? I mean, you wouldn't imagine it'd be like the old guard Bordeaux collector, right?
Not off the bat. So it's following the normal trend for some of these wine things, whereas that they're the absolute darlings of sommeliers. And, they've been used in restaurants now for a long time. And you can see with the propagation of orange wine into mainstream culture that's kind of spreading. So it's going beyond that. And I think it's kind of just now moved on to kind of these connoisseurs or people in the know who like think they're, they know the best of the best from a certain style of wine or a certain region, and they're like, oh, have you ever heard of this producer? But I think since the wines have really been available with age on them now for not that long, the early 2000s and late 90s are really where they're starting to come. I think they're going to be presented in this light alongside some of these other back vintages to more connoisseurs or in restaurants, and kind of open people's eyes more. So I think they'll progress from kind of a sommelier's thing to like an early adopter connoisseur wine nerd, kind of like me, I guess, and then move on more towards the mainstream as people can start actually comparing them hand in hand to some of like the best aged expressions. Because I mean, the tannins are pretty harsh when they're either served improperly, if it's too cold, like when we were talking to the sommelier in DC, or if they're too young, they can be not as appealing to some people who may prefer a little more developed. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, we don't often talk about these maybe like emerging regions or emerging styles, but it's certainly something that we have our finger on the pulse of. I think we can probably expect to see something out of South America in the next 6 months or so from Vint in terms of putting together some collectible wines. And yeah, it's nice to be able to, when you or me or anyone else goes to some of these regions and gets to have experiences like that, to be able to share with folks, because 10, 15 years, it could be a serious market for wines like that. Now that you said that there's already a growing market, but could definitely become more mainstream.
Yeah. And I think like that's a good point, is like you're not going to see an orange wine collection on the Vint platform anytime soon, but like the idea is like we're always as a company looking to see what's trending, what's emerging, and trying to getting our firsthand experience, and then we'll be bringing those opportunities as they mature to the Vint platforms. I mean, there are also red varietals in that region, like a grape called Refosco in Slovenian, that's making these like really nice ageable red wines too, that could way down the line be a collectible wine as well. So it's just getting a sense of where these trends are going. Gen Z as a whole is really interested in these obscure varietals, or varietals that they aren't as familiar with. Not everybody now wants like a cab from every country that they go to, even though Slovenia was trying to grow I had a few Slovenian cabs that were not grown where you're supposed to grow in cab. Like it was really funny. Like it was just not a ripe grape, but they just thought people wanted cab at some point. It's transitioning back, but I was just like, yeah, we were at this like mountain stay on this farm, and I asked them what wines they had, and they had like a sweet muscat of sorts and 2 cabs from Slovenia. One was like the reserve, and one was the other one. It was like this really small farm town. So I asked the lady, I was like, where did these come from? Or like, what other grapes are in these wines? And she's like, well, I don't know what grape is in this one, but I think it's from like Slovenia. And it said like Cabernet really big. And I was like, yeah, I know that one's definitely Cabernet. And then the other one had a fanciful name. And she was like, I don't know what grape is in this one, but it is Cabernet. And I was like, okay, I'm going to try it. So I got it. And the one I got was not good. But it was just showed that like, but the native varietals that we had from there were really good. Like Slovenian wines as a whole blew my mind. Their range of varietals and styles is huge. They have a big limestone plateau called Kars, which is in the southeast, that also goes into Italy, called Carso there, which flows part of Friuli. But they have these beautiful limestone deposits and these varietals that have so much acidity and minerality. So I had a blast just trying the different varietals. There was a version of a variety of Malvasia that I don't know if you know that much about Malvasia, but it had these kind of floral notes that some Malvasias can develop, but they're typically flabby. This one had acid. It was Malvasia di Styria, and it goes down into like Croatia. And I was like, opened my mind. I thought I would never really enjoy many Malvasias, but it was awesome. So yeah. Recommend everybody check out Slovenia.
What are you looking for in an orange wine? Like when, because one of the criticisms is like, it's just not, it's a style that's just not what you do with white grapes. What are you looking for when you're evaluating an orange wine, a white, from white grapes that have been aged extended time on the skins?
Yeah. I mean, for me,
fermented, not aged, I guess.
But they can be aged. I mean, like the Radicon I was talking about, spent 6 months on the skins, probably.
Oh wow, 6 months.
Like 3 to 6. Yeah, the serious
okay.
Like the ones that I was like talking about, like the Radicons or the Grobners, they probably spend 3 to 6 months.
Oh wow, okay. So I'm used to thinking of it as like days or hours.
Yeah, and that is a more approachable style. There's a wine that Radicon makes that his son was making actually while Stingo was still alive, Sasha, called Slatnik, and I got that too. And that's supposed to be like a more approachable style. It has days of skin contact rather than these like, because when you leave them on for months, the tannin is
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
So
okay, yeah, that explains some of its ageability and things like that. I'm like, yeah, what's even happening once you had a wine like that age for 12 years?
Yeah, no, it's wild what they can extract during that time as well. But yeah, I guess when you're looking for an orange wine, it depends on like what you want out of it. But I like to look for acid, number one, but also intention, number two, I guess. Like if somebody's making
it has like a direction, it isn't just like kind of all over the place and out of balance, I guess.
Yeah. It's not just if you're at a winery and they have a bunch of other wines, they just happen to have one orange wine and you ask them about it and they're just like, this is our orange wine. It's just made from the same grapes that we had left over. Like something like that is not great. I tend to think places too that make, I mean, this isn't kind of a blanket statement, but I tend to look for lower alcohol, higher acid wines as a whole. And then this same holds true for these. It means they basically picked them at the right time. They weren't just picking them when they were trying to make a different style of wine and then threw them in.
They didn't just use their,
they didn't just pick
the white grapes that were growing at the same time next to their cab or something. I don't know.
Yeah, or like
it all at once.
Yeah, or if they had some extra Sauvignon Blanc and it was just like super ripe and they made a nice one and then they made this one that's just like seems huge. I mean, that doesn't mean that all of them aren't good like that, but higher that are all lower alcohol. But yeah, I think that tends to be, and I think you can ask sommeliers too, and you can kind of see. Sometimes they describe some as like Gatorade or like fruit punch or like Powerade, and like those ones tend to be like nice and quaffable. Those aren't like serious, or they weren't like the intention. So yeah, you can kind of tell, but it's all about trying ones. It's hard to make any blanket statements because the style varies so much.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, I feel like I haven't missed the boat quite yet. It's still warm out, but it's a style that I'm not usually going to drink in the wintertime for whatever reason, but maybe I should.
Yeah, maybe you get one of the more serious ones. Get a Ribola Jala, or in Slovenia they call it Rebula. But those are more red wines, like basically than orange. I would say you want to drink them about the same temp and all that.
Oh, cool.
So,
all right. Well, maybe we'll spotlight we'll spotlight that this Friday on our weekly newsletter where I forget what the
our like Friday wrap up.
Yeah, the Friday wrap up that we do. So we've been spotlighting what we're drinking this weekend, kind of wines there. Maybe we'll spotlight one of those wines.
Yeah, I'll throw out one of
the similar style.
I'll throw out one of the approachable Radicon ones. I think that
something people can pick up. Yeah.
This one should be able to find in specialty wine shops. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know how many, but yeah. But I will say, Slovenian wine as a whole, everybody should check it out, even if you don't know what the varietal is. Like there's a bunch of varietals that I had never had, and there are other ones that just have different names because it's in Slovenian. So I highly recommend them as a whole. And then anything from Friuli as well. There's just a bunch of interesting wines, but it's hard to find really bad wines from these places. Like I was just saying the Cab wasn't great because they were trying to grow it for somebody else. They thought that's what tourists wanted was Cab, so they grew it, but like the locals weren't drinking that. So
yeah, cool. Awesome. Yeah. Well, everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode. Stay on the lookout today for the 2021 Bordeaux on Primeur collection. Grab your shares, they're $50 a share, and we'll see you next time.
For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vent podcast, please email us at support@vent.co. To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vent platform, find us at www.vent.co. That's www.vint.co. Vent and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vent platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.